Welcome. Today we would like to introduce Andrew Saunders, an architect. We would like to talk about some architecture issues and also post-COVID educations and also his works. Hi Andrew, how are you?
Hi, Gokhan. Hey, thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us. Andrew Saunders is an associate professor of architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, Stuart Weitzman School of Design, and founding principal of Andrew Saunders Architecture Plus Design. Am I correct?
You are correct, yes.
An internationally published, award-winning architecture, design and research practice committed to the tailoring of innovative digital methodologies to provoke novel exchange and assessment of the broader cultural context, right? And the practice innovates the number of scales ranging from product design, exhibition design, and residential and large-scale civic and cultural institutional design. He received his Bachelor of Architecture from University of Arkansas and a Master's in Architecture with distinction from the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Where are you from, Andrew?
Originally, I was born in St. Louis, Missouri. Kind of grew up in Arkansas, which went to University of Arkansas, and then moved to New York, and then have been on the East Coast for quite some time.
Yeah, fantastic. And after the University of Arkansas, you graduated Harvard Graduate School of Design. Why Harvard? Why you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I went to University of Arkansas at probably one of the best times ever to go to University of Arkansas. It was when President Bill Clinton was in office, and so he is from Arkansas, former governor of Arkansas, and the basketball team there was number one, and they won the championship. So that attracted Peter Eisenman to come and teach at my School of Architecture. He enjoyed going to see the Razorbacks when they were number one, so he would schedule his visits around the basketball team's schedule. And then he was also trying to compete for the presidential library, which was at that time Clinton Library. And I happened to be take his course and then was his TA for the kind of my fifth year. And he invited me to come work in New York. So I was in New York for 3 years working at Eisman and teaching at Cooper Union for a while. And at that time, I probably, from my undergraduate to when I finally decided to go back to graduate school, probably changed my mind a number of times, was looking at that time at Princeton, Columbia, Harvard, all of these schools. So for me, my choice to go to Harvard came later in the sort of a third year where most of the people that I was working with at Eisman Architects, like Hernan Alonso Diaz and Florencia, and these people were starting to teach at Columbia. At that time, I liked Columbia as well, but I didn't want to go back and and be taught by the people I was just working with. Princeton was kind of going over some kind of leadership changes at that time, and Harvard was kind of, for me, curious just because I'd been in New York and didn't know so much about Boston. And then Toshiko Mori was the chair there where I was teaching at Cooper Union. She had strong ties at Cooper Union, and Preston Scott Cohen was there, who I always admired his work, and it just was the right fit for me to kind of be in Boston for a little while outside of New York, because I'd kind of become familiar with a lot of those. So, but it's interesting, I think always these graduate schools are always changing. Probably the thing that I always looked at is the kind of leadership in those schools, at what time, who is leader, and that makes a huge difference on your experience. And, I did the post-professional, so that was a quick, 2 years. So when you come in with only 2 years, you kind of have to know what you're getting. You don't have that much time to be there for it to kind of mature if there's new leadership or there's others. So at that point, Harvard was the best. I enjoyed it, and worked with President Scott Cohen there and a number of projects as well. It was a great time, great experience.
Toshiko Mori time in Harvard, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And that time, almost the Chumi time in Colombia.
Yes, right. Mm-hmm. Yes, it was when I applied to Columbia, Shumi was still the dean. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you were awarded to Skidmore, Onyx Miller Research and Traveling Fellowship for Masters of Architecture.
Right. So when I graduated, SOM has a big competition for all the graduating architecture schools, and sent in my portfolio, which was a big long shot. I mean, it was a huge. It was excellent to win. Probably what put me into teaching is that I won that fellowship, and at that point, I was looking to kind of go back. I was actually interviewing with Frank Gehry for a while to go to the West Coast to work for him, and I won the SOM fellowship. So it was fantastic. It was a surprise. But one of the things about that is at that point, I mean, now it's really has a pretty big purse. I think it's like $60,000 now. But at that time, it was only $15,000. So in order to, support myself and everything, was hard to just take off and do that fellowship. And so I ended up kind of going back into teaching. I had already taught at Cooper, but back into teaching full time so I could actually do the fellowship in the summer. So it was an amazing fellowship to go around and look at all the early 20th century concrete masters in France, Spain, Italy. It was an incredible trip.
Yeah, and then you were interested in European classical, let's say the classical European architecture, mostly Baroque time, period of Baroque, especially in Italy.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, the Baroque. I became quite familiar when I was teaching at RPI. I was asked to coordinate their Rome program for a semester abroad, and I was just coming off of looking at the geometry of those early 20th century concrete masters, and I was thinking about doing the studio looking at Nervi specifically, but it just came to me that it's a Baroque city. When you're in there, you really need to have students looking at the Baroque. And so at that point, I had all the students go kind of live in all of these buildings. And that was really pre-Grasshopper kind of era where we were actually writing sort of Visual Basic scripts to look at the polar geometry that comes out of the arc and chord for a lot of the work of Boromini, Rinaldi, Bernini, and Cortona, looking at a lot of those churches in there. So they were analyzing it through strictly the geometry, but I came to know a lot of those churches. We had a really nice exhibition at the Italian Culture Institute in New York of that work, and that was, I think it was the studio was about 97 and 2000. So that's when I was kind of introduced to it. Probably the basis, though, is when I was working for Eisman Architects, I was also teaching at Cooper Union. And if anybody's familiar with the kind of Cooper Union sort of pedagogy at that time, they sort of had masters at each level. So someone like Raymond Abraham would be teaching first year. Peter Eisman he sort of taught second year analysis. So it was 2 semesters where you would spend one semester looking at the sort of deep structures of a particular architect. For instance, we would redraw all of the Corb early villas with all the students, build basswood models. And then the next semester would be to try to produce architectural results out of this kind of generative analysis. So that's when my kind of introduction to teaching, and I really enjoyed the kind of luxury of being in academia and having that space and time to really look at architecture. You just don't have that when you kind of get out in the professional world. Everything is working so fast. You don't have that sort of long period to really look deeply at these things. So when I had gone to teach at Rome, I basically took that format, but instead of looking at Corb villas, we were looking at the Baroque and doing analysis there. So I think part of my interest came from both teaching in Rome, but also the sort of analysis of architecture was great. Learning how to teach that at Cooper in that period too. So it's a bit of an extension of those two. Actually, when I was hired, recently, I guess now 6 years ago, to come teach at Penn, one of the things outside of teaching studios, they asked me to take some of the work that I had done on the Baroque and teach at Penn because nobody was teaching anything like that at Penn at that time. So it's kind of interesting. I teach a Baroque seminar at Penn, which no one in the master's level or the graduate level is teaching anything before 1850. So their history with Joan Achman starts at 1850 and goes forward, which is fantastic, but nobody was teaching anything before that. And so I started to teach that and had a lot of interest for the students really want to know that, sort of know the canon, which, unfortunately, there's not too many people teaching the canon anymore. And it's kind of a real desire by students to really kind of understand a little bit more about the kind of history of the discourse, history of the architecture. So when I first started teaching, I put in for an application for an internal grant to go back to Italy um, and research this. I was also finishing the book. I had a book contract to do, and the grant was relatively small. I mean, it was good size for architecture, but it capped out at $50,000. So I called Faro, who is the kind of premier laser scanner company, one of them, and asked them if they would support me. I had this grant. It capped out at $50,000 because at that time the machine itself was $50,000. I said, if I use the grant
50,
money
right?
to
50.
50, yeah, 50, yes. I said if I use the grant money to purchase the
Yeah.
scanner, then I'll be in my office in Philadelphia. I won't be able to travel. So they were very generous and allowed me to borrow one of their scanners for a month, and I coordinated with the Faro office in Torino, and they sent me the scanner in Rome. So that was kind of the how all of this sort of started. And then I used the work, a lot of the scans in the archive now have brought it back to Penn, and we use it teaching
And
in the seminar.
Andrew, let me ask a question.
Sure.
What was your purpose? What is your purpose? Why do you want to search that period? Also, kind of, because in general, the many architecture studio professor and teachers prefer explain and teach about modern architecture. Why do you? I know the always Peter Eisenman mentioned he wants to teach not today, not present, not future. Almost he is interested in the past. And then
Yeah, for me,
you follow that kind of, it's in the idea, but your work is very precisely and high technology, and also about the understanding the making space. It's not about maybe the ornaments, but I think maybe they help to understand the whole making space. What is the making space? Please please explain to us what was your purpose beyond that.
yeah. So yeah, that's a great question. I mean, maybe the best way to answer is a kind of what I try to teach within the seminar, right? About the Baroque, why the Baroque. I mean, on a very simple level, I think the Baroque is kind of one of the more complex architectures that's been built and exist out there, and it's really fascinating.
Because the question about the always, especially Baroque, Rococo, sometimes the Renaissance, forbidden by modern architecture understanding and learning.
Well, it's interesting you say that. I mean, it's funny because I had lunch with Peter Eisman,
Crime
and we
and
discussed
ornament, because they always
right.
complain and also blame about that period encourages the ornament.
I had lunch with Peter and discussed the project a little bit. He was telling me that Colin Rowe and so been forbidden a bit, but I think especially within the contemporary scene, I think the Baroque has such multiplicity. There are many architects that kind of have engaged it and taken on it. So if someone, for instance, Venturi, right, contemporary Peter, half of these churches are in complexity and contradiction. There's a number of Moretti taking on the Baroque. There are a number of kind of contemporary designers that take on the Baroque, and it has such multiplicity that you can always get different things out of it. But I think, one of the things in terms of, it's been a little bit of a psychoanalysis for my own kind of history, working with Peter, working with Scott Cohen, teaching at Cooper Union. There's kind of a formalist legacy of the kind of American avant-garde. And for me, it all begins with the Baroque. And so what do I mean by that? I mean, the original book by Heinrich Wölfflin, The Renaissance and the Baroque, that was his second book. So Wölfflin is the kind of founder of formalism with Elos Regal. And so Wölfflin, when he was earning his PhD, his first book is on the psychology of architecture, where he was testing theories of empathy as a way in which to take in psychoanalytical analysis on form of architecture as a more kind of, let's say, a more scientific way of understanding architecture and art. And so in order to teach, Wölfflin had to write a second book, and he writes the Renaissance and the Baroque. And what's interesting about that book is he goes down into Rome, and he uses these psychoanalytical techniques to discuss the kind of tendencies of Renaissance versus the tendencies of the Baroque. And it's kind of one of the first sort of books that really unlocks and starts to describe the Baroque in a compelling way as a contemporary discourse on architecture. And I think that's one of the beginnings of formalism right there. And it is the kind of foundation of that. So you can trace that legacy all the way up through, Vitkover, Rowe, Eisenman, New York Five, and there. But I think that's the sort of foundation of formalism, is Wölfflin writing that and using those psychoanalytical techniques to basically assess an architecture that really didn't have a specific canon, right? It wasn't really until someone like Guarini, much later in the late Baroque, actually writes a treatise on that. So at that point, the assessment of that architecture through psychoanalytical terms of kind of understanding through empathy, and these becomes a way to kind of decode it. So for me, that's the beginning. So the way that I teach is that the Baroque is the foundation, and try to bring it all the way up through the contemporary to students that I'm teaching, that the Baroque is kind of at the roots of what they're even learning today.
Yeah, I think you think there are coordination, relationship between the Baroque style and also today's computational computer-aided design, and also the understanding and creating that kind of the space. Do you think that?
Yeah, certainly. I mean,
what is the relationship? Why we now today the more capable of understanding more than the modern period, because the concentration was totally different than the Baroque and other periods. But today we already again are interested in that time, especially the making space techniques.
Certainly, I mean, there are a few things, what the kind of renewed relevance. One of the ways to frame the project, the Baroque topologies, is one as a representational project, right? And there's a long history of architectural representation. So the surveying technique using a LiDAR laser scanner generates a number of straight lines that come back and develop points, millions and millions of points. But it's based on a whole lineage of surveying tools, which were pre-geometry, pre-perspective, and kind of pre-representation, but at the heart of architectural representation. So one of the questions the project asks outside of just the Baroque is, what value do these kind of new tool sets, these new instruments of technology, specifically LiDAR in this sense, what role do they play within the kind of longer role of architectural representation? So, for instance, typically people that are using LiDAR surveying technology are using it, one, for as-built conditions, and two, for verification, so verifying certain measurements and this kind of thing. So the project is to ask a little bit in the sense that this technology is becoming increasingly accessible, certainly with photogrammetry as well as a reality capture. There's going to be a point where students are now, or anyone's going to these buildings and be able to do this without the aid of an expensive machine. So how does that kind of enter into representation? That's one aspect of it. Specifically in terms of the space, there's a famous article written by Luigi Moretti, who was the Italian moderist. And in that article, Structures and Sequences of Form, he specifically goes through a kind of survey of Italian architecture, starting from Adrian's Villa, working through the Renaissance, Palladio, Mannerism, all the way, and ends kind of in Baroque with two unbuilt works by Guarini, where he was making plaster casts of the interior of those spaces. And that article builds a lot on this the kind of historian August Schmarsau. Now, August Schmarsau wrote or lectured and wrote an important piece where he was advocating for space as the essence of architecture. And until that point, that was kind of, until that point, there was no real formal framing of the idea of architectural space. And what he was arguing was kind of against architecture being relegated to just an applied art. He was saying that it really deserves to be a fine art with sculpture and with painting. And he was saying, what does architecture do that validates it as a fine art? And it was that it is the creatress of space, right? And so none of the other fine arts do that. And so that influenced Moretti to then do the plaster molds of the interiors of those space. So that was one of the kind of proof of concepts when I originally had done the LiDAR scans, was kind of first, can we reproduce this idea of just encapsulating the space? Because the Baroque has this real interesting relationship with the interior and the exterior, where the interior and the exterior, unlike modernism, they're completely separate worlds. And so once you kind of get into the interior of any of these Baroque spaces, they have their own autonomy. They're their own sort of cosmologies that you're in. So the Baroque was really interesting in that aspect. And I think I would argue that the Baroque is, for all of its multiplicity, not only in terms of geometry, but material, light, figuration, everything that goes with it, is been kind of underrepresented. It's been hard to represent all of that in a while. So what this survey does is allow you to kind of understand the sort of autonomy of that interior in a completely new way. You can see it holistically. So its title, kind of Baroque Topologies, has a number of meanings, but one of them is it gives you a topological way to view this. So you can see the inside from the outside, especially in some of the point clouds and those kind of meshes. So it's a completely new architectural representation of these kind of complex autonomous interiors. You can start to see them holistically and understand them and how they're working. So, we did a number of models where we built them out of 3D printed resin polymer, and to kind of be in dialogue with those original Moretti models. But they're very different. Moretti was a modernist, and so his models were very streamlined. They have no ornament in them, right? They're purely reductive into the geometry and the formal sequences of those. Even though the Guarini ones are quite complex, they have none of the sort of ornament, figuration, light, any of these things in them. Also, Moretti's interesting that he does do St. Peter's, and then he jumps to Guarini. He never cast any of Boromini or Bernini, even though he was from Rome. And I always wonder that. And I think probably from his kind of modernist tendency, and also from Schmarsau, who was arguing for space, the way one realizes space is through motion, either perceived motion or actually walking through space. So you need that sequence of forms. So he was always looking at sequences. So St. Peter's has a sequence through all the different editions, and Guarini has sequences through his kind of modules that he puts together in the churches. So maybe for that reason he didn't do any of the kind of real Baroque churches in Rome in terms of any of the ones that I surveyed. Also, his survey is more wide spanning in terms of going from Adrian's Villa all the way to the Baroque. So it's a large period, where mine is just of those Baroque projects.
Yeah, another question about if you look at the Baroque period architecture, the moves from down to up. But today's the computational, computer-aided design almost interested in the fluidity and the dynamic human behaviors, and also the movement, only horizontal, not like to do the up down to up or up to down. But the maybe some skyscrapers design shows us some issues down to the up, but in general the making space, the Baroque style, the some issues, the dome and walls, and the down to the up, and also the step by step goes up, is interesting relationship for making space. Did you realize in that kind of the differentiation, and also what was their idea? Was that kind of the design is making space, but holistically starts from the down to the up, and always the relationship, creating a relationship for human from to the earth to the sky, and that kind of the philosophy. What?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly that's present in all of these churches. Right? That they're the the idea that one, as the kind of human experience, walks through these churches. There's the kind of mortal level that's more crude, and then as you kind of ascend to the kind of celestial other cosmologies above, they get more and more complex. Probably San Evo by Boromini is probably the easiest one to kind of clearly see that. It starts with the most crude polygon, which is a triangle, and it ends at the top of the sphere, the most complex geometry, the most faces as a sphere. It's interesting you say that. I mean, there's a few kind of answers for that. One, what has been nice about using the LiDAR surveys, what I've tried to do as a representation is never never repeat or try to show you the human experience or the human anthropological view, right? There are always views that one, and I'm not trying to, it's not about a virtual reality that tries to supplant the experience of visiting these. It's more about seeing these as objects, seeing these kind of theatrical devices from the outside and understanding them in a different way, in a certain way, trying to make what is so familiar. Most architects are very familiar with many of these buildings, especially Boromini, Bernini, and Guarini. And the challenge of trying to take this familiar work and show it in an unfamiliar way, right? Um, and so every view that you see, every kind of representation is not that sort of subjective view that one anticipates. So um, if you look at Renaissance versus Baroque, Renaissance is considered more objective, that this perspective was constructed and then things are placed into it, where the Baroque would be more subjective, where it's really about the experience and the subject is being manipulated through a lot of what Wolfland would call painterly effects. So when Wolfland talks about painterly effects, he's talking about the idea of the Baroque painting. Anybody there, uh, you know, uh, talking about certain ideas of chiaroscuro, certain ideas of motion, certain ideas of depth that are happening in paintings. Caravaggio would be somebody that would be kind of very easy to look at and understand how these illusions are working. So Wolfland talks about the Baroque as being painterly, right? As the painterly style, where Baroque is trying to enact a lot of those kind of same elusiveness and dynamism with these trompe l'oeils and all other things, deep reliefs. And one of the things, if you look at someone like Gideon in a space and time, he would say that the Baroque was always trying to create these illusions. And it started originally with creating the on the ceiling. You were talking about the highest realm of these kind of cupolas and these domes are where all of the kind of special effects really happen above you, right? To try to create these illusions of this ever expanding space. It's interesting because the Baroque interior on one end is completely autonomous and cut off from the exterior. On the other hand, it's also about infinite expansion and trying to show this. So the effects of these kind of trompe-l'oeils and these painterly effects begin by first painting illusions. Then they start to become a little bit more three-dimensional, maybe through relief, where you see ideas of ribs layered on copper. So you start to get these kind of depth. And then you finally get to Guarini in San Lorenzo, where the ribs actually separate from the dome structure, or at least the lantern. And so Gideon would say that was the first time that these kind of elusive painterly effects become purely architectural. And then if you take someone like Vittoni, who extends Guarini's legacy, this is when all of those kind of cupolas just start to delaminate and come apart completely architecturally. So it's a fascinating kind of evolution from the kind of beginning of the painterly within the Rome high Baroque, and then as you kind of get to the Piedmont area with Vittoni all the way, where these kind of painterly effects work. And that's, we just had this conversation on a review the other day where, Florencia's review, teaching Sire, which she's actually one of the first people Florencia Pita, that I worked with at Eisman Architects, but she was working with paint and using paint strokes within different things. And we were just having the conversation that this idea of painting and architecture and sculpture and architecture seem to be, there's a question of where the discipline of architecture lies within those. But the nice things about looking at the Baroque, the 6 architects that I kind of analyzed, none of them had a bachelor's or master's of architecture, right? They all start.
Yeah, which is really interesting, right? Very interesting point.
Yeah, so
always we have the dilemma about how can we teach in architecture and how can we learn architecture. That's the interesting, right? There is no bachelor program for them. Yeah, okay, continue. Sorry.
Well, yeah, I would just say someone like Boromini. I would say one of the interesting things that's come out of working with the scan material, working with students, is that I think all architects have probably a tendency to really admire Boromini. He's incredible. I mean, no one can deny that. And typically, it's a admiration for his geometry, right? And his mastery of geometry comes from he was a stonemason. He understood geometry, understood projective geometry, stereotomy, all of these kind of things. But other people, like Bernini, who, is accomplished sculptor, he gets that. His architecture comes much later. He only did 3 churches at the end, but, he comes at it as a sculptor. So if you understand that and you look at the scans, someone like Irving Lavin, who was Sylvia Lavin's father, who taught at Princeton, he wrote about Bernini. He says that he's kind of the first to mix all of those arts, sculpture, painting, architecture, as bel composto. So you go through and you look at Bernini, he sets up the architecture in a very classical way in the terms of he has 3 churches and they're really classic parties. One's a cruciform, one's a circular plan, kind of a remake of the Pantheon, the other's kind of an oval plan. And the radical Bernini is not the geometry. It's really when you kind of get into back when with the kind of figuration, he starts to blur all those thresholds that he set up. So he's kind of a true mannerist in the sense that he sets the rules and then he breaks them with a lot of sculpture and pushing and pulling different boundaries, the way that, hands will go into paintings, the way sculptures are kind of nested between different areas of pilasters to cornices, and the way that they all see it, it's a huge theater. There are others that are in the survey too. Someone like Cortona, who was literally a painter. He's probably best known as painting, to understand how he uses layers in painting and then comes back and recreates those in one of his kind of best interiors, which is Santa Luca e Martina. You can understand how these painted layers are working. So the nice thing about the survey is that even though these architects are grouped into Baroque, they all came at it from different sort of discourses, and they all have, let's say, different tropes in the way that they kind of operate. And those tropes aren't purely geometric. So it's kind of given me an appreciation of like reading Rinaldi and Bernini, even though, of course, I love Boromini, but I think that it's given the students the kind of new way to appreciate once you kind of understand all of that goes the complexity of light, figuration, color, any of these kind of other things outside of geometry, outside of the kind of governing geometry, which is fascinating as well. Gives you kind of a new way of understanding it. So when, I hear the term painterly thrown out a lot in terms of contemporary people talk about painterly in reviews and this kind of thing. But this is the original painterly of people as architects trying to transpose these kind of painterly effects into architectural consequences.
And also, there is a big competition between Boromini and Bernini. I always want to shoot a movie about their tension, their competition. It's very always, the Eisman told about their relationship, also the committed suicide. This is a really interesting scenario for shooting a movie.
Yeah, they both, career-wise, in terms of their career arcs, they both had ups and downs, right? They weren't in lockstep. So, certainly, I think, in his early career, Bernini was favored by the popes. Boromini was working with him. So if you go to the St. Peter's and, the kind of altarpiece there, even though it's attributed to Bernini, Boromini was helping him build it. He didn't really know. For a long time, they were working together. And I think, with San Carlino Quattrofontane, that's the first time that Boromini kind of gets out of Bernini's shadow and is able to do his own thing. then there was a time when Bernini proposed different bell towers for St. Peter's, and they built them, but they started to fall down, so they had to take them down. And Bernini was run out of town, right? So he lost his favoritism, and Boromini, when he does the facade of Agnesi, which is in Piazza Navona, most people kind of know that church right across from the sort of four fountains. Um, if you look at that sort of facade, some people say that was kind of Borromini telling the Pope at that point, this is how I would have done the bell towers of Bernini. Later on in his career, the sort of chapel of Rimage, which is in the kind of propaganda area, that's one of his Borromini's later works, which is really beautiful work that completely embodies the golden section, golden rectangle. It's like a really perfect work. But before that, he kind of demoed another Bernini chapel that was in there as well. So they kind of have a relationship of I think that also though at Sant'Ivo, when Borromini got the commission to Sant'Ivo, I think Bernini actually recommended him to the Pope. So they had an up and down relationship, and of course, Borromini dies later by suicide, by his own sword, at kind of an earlier death at that time. Bernini's architecture, was much later in his career, when he was actually moving out of sculpture, moving out of side chapels, and finally getting to do full constructed architecture. But yeah, it's an interesting rivalry. Sure, certainly
I
needs to be a
always
film.
been in Piazza Navona. Always think about their relationship. What was that? What is the Bernini and his sculpture, and also the Boromini church? It's the cross to each other. It's really interesting, the story, and at the same square.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that's there's, I don't know how much of it is totally true, but it makes for a good story that some of the
As a
sculptures are
fiction,
looking away from it.
maybe some,
Yeah,
yeah, fiction, but that kind of fiction is important for not only the non-architecture issue, also for architects or students. It's really interesting to talk about that kind of relationship beyond the buildings.
well, yeah. I mean, all of those major Baroque architects all were, working together in this. So for instance, you're talking about the relationship of Bernini's fountain to San Ignazio's facade. But if you look at San Ignazio, it was started by Rinaldi's father, and then kind of Rinaldi, Borromini takes over that, and then he gets released from that commission as different politics change, and Rinaldi comes back and finishes that building. So if you read something like Deleuze, The Fold, and he's talking about the Baroque, he talks about one point that church is the epitome of the Baroque, about the difference between interior and exterior, having different autonomies, and that one's an easy target because they're two different architects. So Borromini had kind of very little to do with the interior. It's mostly Rinaldi. The exterior is Borromini. So all of those architects and those pivotal figures, depending on how politics change within their lifespan, were kind of swapping commissions, finishing up each other's commissions, tearing down each other's commissions, building up everything. So it must have been a fantastic time to be an architect in Rome, and so much building happening.
Yeah, Andrew, the next question about your studio at the university faculty. What is your program? You teach them the Baroque typologies or something like that, and then what you are expecting from them? What is your program? How do you manage your architectures?
I mean, this question about the contemporary design and the Baroque. So there's two things that I primarily teach. I teach studio. I coordinate the first year, first semester, and then teach in the second semester of the whole first year of the master's program. And then I offer the Baroque seminar, which is kind of an advanced seminar for third year students typically, in the sequence. So within the seminar, it has the kind of luxury of not necessarily designing a building. So we just take that time to look closer at these Baroque works, and we kind of work on speculative objects that kind of interrogate or analyze or just become a different way of reading those buildings, never with the idea of proposing an architectural building at the end. It's just a seminar. And that's a tremendous amount of fun to kind of work with the students on. Studio wise, I bring in a lot of these concepts a little bit differently. For instance, we work with a lot of geometry and polar geometry, ideas of interior and exterior. For instance, the first thing the students design in our first year that I coordinate, we worked with the Penn Museum, which is a fantastic museum. It's kind of one of the largest university anthropological and archaeological museums, and they have a tremendous amount of artifacts, all kind of non-Western cultures. And the students go into the museum and actually work in the archives, and they find vessels, and they start by scanning those vessels as a way to kind of understand that. Then they take those vessels and they design what we say is a container for those vessels, which the container has a different boundary shape than the actual vessel. So it's a way of starting this. It's a quick exercise, 2-week exercise. I'm not super explicit about it, but in a certain way, you can see almost any of the churches, the Baroque churches, that same thing. It's kind of a little model of San Carlino, where it has a autonomous interior versus a different exterior, right? The second semester is really about taking on the city and working within a city. It's not urban design, but it's an architectural project that has a scale and scope that's large enough to affect the urban morphology and work within kind of the urban morphology of Philadelphia. One of the aspects I've been really interested in lately is the idea of relief, and from a very classic a classic definition where somebody like Hildebrand would say there are 3 types of relief. There's the bas relief, which is very low, flat; high relief, which is kind of almost 2.75D, where it has ambitions to almost be 3-dimensional. And then there's actually a third type of relief, which is figural relief, where it actually operates in 3 dimensions, but still is the relief. So these are things that are very clearly evident within a lot of the Baroque, these ideas of relief, and they work in a painterly. Even someone Wolflin argues that painterly style of all these illusions of depth, shadow, light is relief. He talks about the Baroque as relief. So we build reliefs and work in relief as ways to kind of engage the urban morphology of these different models. So in a certain sense, the designs are contemporary. They certainly don't seek to kind of mimic style-wise the Baroque, but I do use a lot of the kind of principles, the underlying principles that come from the Baroque in contemporary ways within the kind of studio culture, where we do actually, end up with a, kind of proper architectural proposal at the end. It's different, a little different than this seminar. Oh, I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
The question is, you've been in Istanbul and other Anatolia cities?
No, I haven't been to Istanbul. I really would love to go. I have to get out of Rome.
We organize your visit to Anatolia, especially Istanbul, the third Rome, Hagia Sophia, and other great architects, Sinan works. Because the Hagia Sophia is the 5 times bigger than any Baroque churches. It's interesting the scale. Also understanding with you, it's really a pleasure for us with your students. Then from UPenn, the 3 times the Ferda was here, also Vinka Dubuldum, and we would like to share with you some knowledge, and we would like to discover with you what is their scale and space atmosphere.
Yeah, it would be a real privilege. I would love to visit Turkey, visit Istanbul. I mean, what an incredible city. So I will accept your invitation. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I've seen the work,
And
I've seen the work and participated on reviews with Ferda that's coming out. Really incredible. I love that product. I mean, Ferda knows this. I have a deeper amount of respect. I think, Ferda's project, in a way, similar to my project, where it's kind of it's an analytical approach to the city, right? And that he's really kind of teaching people to see the city, rebuilding pieces of it, working with the actual layer. So, I've been impressed completely with the work that's come out of that. Such a fertile ground for innovation.
yeah, let's take some questions on the
Sure.
screen. Onur Dimez asking, what would you like to say the young generation to get more interested into history and theory?
Yeah, it's, of course, for me, a lot of this has been a bit selfish, where I want to learn more about, these buildings. I want to learn more about my own kind of place in the sort of history of architecture, in terms of all the way back, to the canon, the original pieces. I think it's an interesting time for architecture. I think there's not, a lot of the canonical work is not being taught. It's being rethought of, which it definitely should be thought of with kind of new contemporary politics. I think probably, from PhD work in history and theory, the canon, the Baroque, Renaissance, all of those are such, deeply kind of studied and have so much scholarship already around them, that most of the kind of area for new terrain of contemporary ideas about the environment, equity, and these kind of things are more fertile grounds for kind of PhD discoveries. So in an odd way, I feel a lot of the kind of history. I mean, there's history and theory, which are always coupled in a different way, but I do think a lot of that sort of phased out. And I think students in general have a desire to know more about the discourse and the kind of history of the discourse. So that's like at Penn, where I'm teaching, and I don't know if this is typical at other schools, but I'm the only one teaching anything from before 1850, and I'm the only one teaching students how to work with LiDAR scanning and these kind of things. So it's a little bit of both, but I think you have to have. I always try to have a perspective of using new technology to kind of come up against a lot of the kind of other ways. It's just different ways of opening up history, different ways of seeing history. I think that each generation, it means different things. If you look at the Baroque, there's so many people that have kind of thrown themselves in it and get different things out of it. So like I was mentioning earlier, there's Moretti looking at the Baroque from a modernist. There's Venturi looking at the Baroque from postmodern kind of Mannerist style. There's certainly the 90s, Greg Lynn, Deleuze. There was a lot of ideas of the Baroque being continuous, right? Which actually, the surveys, you actually survey and get all the details there. It's really not that continuous. Obviously, there are others like Boromini that really try to bring in continuity, but it's very discrete, and so is a lot of the others discrete. But I think, I actually think the idea of continuity is more of a modernist tendency that was sort of projected onto a lot of the Baroque as well. But the point being is, I think each generation each has different ways of kind of seeing the history and the different ways in which they see. Technology influences a lot of the way that people see and people understand stuff. So that's one of the things in this project is, can we see these Baroque works in a different way? That was sort of one of the challenges through new technology.
Yeah,
So I encourage them. It doesn't have to be
yeah,
the Baroque; it can be any part.
for example,
Well, I think for me, I think you just want to have a deep dive into any of those kind of things. Try to become an expert in one of them, one of these areas or arenas, and in order to kind of dive deeply, you get connected to all the other ones. So trying to become an expert in the Baroque means that you have to go back to the Renaissance and back to Vitruvius and all of this as well, but also look forward in terms of the kind of idea of formalism and how that originated as a concept all the way to the contemporary. So I think, there could be certainly any sort of period within architecture, say Gothic, you want to take on the Gothic and really dwell down, it's going to have connections that go into the contemporary and also into the past. So just, diving down deep is a way of kind of learning all of history through a kind of particular lens.
for you, what is interesting architects in the modern period?
Um, you're talking about in
You
terms
would like
of,
to, yeah, you would like to go to LiDAR and then the screen program. Which architect is important or interesting for you?
that's always a tough question.
Because they always the Baroque, the that kind of the holistic architecture always, the visitors, the if you step in any space, look it up, and it's very rich and highly created the space and also the walls and some you look at that, for example, it's just amazing. But
I
then
think, maybe,
the contemporary architects, mostly, let's say, the modern architects, is interested in different things. The relationship in the programming and some, the functions and
hmm,
the construction details and the making, especially we discussed that kind of the situation with the pillar. We talk about the Greek and Rome differences, and also north and south, especially modern architecture, because some modern architects follow the Greek ideas. Some of them, the no corner, follows some Roman creation typology and formulas, and also the
well,
north
I mean,
and south. North more interested in abstraction, the south interesting in about this space and then orientation.
yeah, it's interesting. I'm just thinking when you're talking about that. I mean, I would say Louis Kahn has been becoming, obviously teaching at University of Pennsylvania. Kahn has become a lot more interesting to me. I think when I first learned about Kahn, it was really through a modernist lens, right? Material, function, hiding the ducts, details, all of these kind of things, which is part of him. But looking at Kahn, everything changed once he won the Rome Prize. He visits Rome. Got it.
I think Andrew, could you, yeah, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, yes. Sorry.
We lost you.
I'm
You
back.
talking about the Louis Kahn.
Right. So Louis, Kahn is interesting because he embodies both of those principles. So what I was saying when I originally kind of learned from about Kahn in my undergraduate, it was through a modernist lens, a modernist perspective. A lot of things you're talking about there, but after his studies in Rome, he won the Rome Prize. His architecture changes drastically. Probably the better period of his, after that, he goes from modernism to, I would say, probably one of the first kind of postmodernists, bringing a lot of these ideas back in. He was certainly, referencing somebody like Choisy, right? So Choisy, is another surveyor. Choisy was a French engineer who started surveying a lot of the kind of Roman ruins, and he invented the worm's eye perspective, right? The Choisy view as an axon looking up, because he really wanted to understand the vaults. And somebody like Choisy really didn't care about the exterior. So this whole idea of the interior of the space, kind of like similar to Moretti, then in Choisy's architecture history books, he tells the whole history of architecture only by looking at bays and interior. All these are the worm's eye bays. He never shows you anything about the exterior of a building or at site context or anything. So, looking, at Kahn now through those lens, you can take something like the Kimball Art Museum. It's really, very Choisy, where it's just all about bays putting together, not really concerned about the exterior as well. But also in terms of those classic notions, you talk about the Greek and the Roman. If you go see Kahn's early baths in Trenton, it's really interesting. Those are really clear points. The bathhouse is actually kind of based on a 9 square, which he calls his Roman, his Roman pavilion. And then a little bit, about 300 feet away from that, there's actually a playground that is then the Greek. So it's actually has small slab pavilions that have different rhythms of columns, and they're all kind of at different skewed things, kind of like the Acropolis, right? And if you look at Kahn's work, anything from like Exeter and these, it's always those kind of Greek and Roman ideas coming together, where he has the voided corners. So you're never entering straight. You're always kind of forced to the oblique and all of these, but also from the kind of robust structure of the kind of Roman as well. So it's interesting. I think in terms of, you're talking about contemporary architects, maybe just from my own experience, working at Eisenman, I did a number of projects, but probably the biggest thing was I was the kind of lead designer at one point on Santiago Compostela, which is a large project in Spain, where I was doing all the interiors. The interiors were completely, the competition was won with an amazing exterior and had some plans, but those plans quickly were thrown out because the client redid the program, shifted everything, scaled. For instance, it had a cruciform. Well, it had an opera house in it. It wasn't a cruciform for the competition. And the client wanted to make it then a bigger opera house, a cruciform opera house. So it expanded, it became bigger. And, from the competition, Peter wanted to keep the exterior exactly the same. So we really literally scaled the whole thing up to accommodate this larger theater, where all the other program became a lot smaller in the other buildings. So we were ended up with these kind of interiors that we were designing that had totally different systems than the exterior. And I would consider those very Baroque spaces. All the interiors have this kind of autonomy that has nothing really to do with the exterior, but they're their own things. When I went to graduate school, I worked with Scott Cohen. I mean, I would have to say I would put him, Peter and him up there with major contemporary architects. So I think Scott's really one of the best contemporary architects operating right now. We worked on Tel Aviv there. So he had, in addition to the Tel Aviv Museum, I worked on the competition with him. It was just going to be and a few others in his office at the GSD at that point. And I mean, now he has a much larger office than this, but we won that competition. It was a lot of fun. But that building is all started from an interior space, right? So the interior is this core all made out of hyperbolic parabola. So they're all, let's say, four edge surfaces that the site is really complex. And so it has a lot of different directions. And that interior space works to bring light in and project light into the other galleries, but it also kind of twists and turns to accommodate the different site. But that whole interior was developed way before we had an exterior at all. It was always kind of in a sense, those projects to me, in my own kind of, we're always kind of concerned with the interior way before ever dealing with the exterior, and the exterior was just another part of the project. And I thought those projects, have Baroque tendencies, even though they're contemporary in that sense.
All right. And another question for Andrew. From Brazil, architects and academics are debating how housing has been produced to date and assess that the quarantine has shown how much the current model doesn't not meet people's needs. Susan Questia from Brazil. Hello, Susan.
Hi, Susan. Thanks for the question. Yeah, I mean, that's a really relevant question, especially to ask when we're all operating out of our homes, right? Where the kind of domesticity in the space of the domestic has completely changed due to this pandemic. And the question, maybe that kind of segues a little bit into the question of teaching. I know it's not specifically about housing, but I'm here, I'm teaching, I'm interviewing, I'm in my house. And I think, how does that open up the model, the typology of housing? How do we kind of incorporate this? I think probably it's a little too early to say. I think there's a lot of different experiences. I was quite concerned when we went to online teaching about the kind of final review format, which is something that's pretty typical in architecture, that has, a lot of kind of studio cultural implications of being there in person, presenting the work. And I don't think, the online reviews didn't necessarily supplant that. And I wouldn't say they were, let's say, better or worse, but they did open up, a lot of different opportunities. Obviously, having international audiences, bringing people closer to the work. There's a different kind of focus that happens when you're focusing on the screen and the work than in a pinup, in a review, and these kind of things. So I think that, back to the kind of general question about living and housing, I think at this period, we're kind of looking at things that we're kind of unable to do, but we're finding new possibilities that we are able to do within the kind of domestic landscape within this. So I think, hopefully things return at some point kind of back into aren't as drastic as the situation. And I think that's kind of a point where we'll have to assess what we've learned from this and kind of how does that integrate into those typologies, from everything from housing to teaching to learning, everything.
Susan continues, for you, Andrew, what changes will occur in the residential architecture? What is your idea?
Yeah, I think, that's a really good question. I guess the question, is the value of, personal meetings, personal interface, all of these within education. I think those are really valuable, especially within architecture. But at the same time, corporations are finding that they can have meetings, don't need to have travel. They can have all of these meetings. People can become sufficient from operating within the kind of home environment. So, I would imagine, I kind of make this comparison to sort of the recession when it hit kind of, around 2008, that sort of time. I think that many companies, many schools, everyone really downsized their production and really asked their kind of workers, employees to do a lot more. And I don't know if we ever recovered from that. In a certain sense, I think everything got a little bit slimmed out, and for better or worse, institutions and corporations found that they could run effectively still and be agile with less kind of people. And I think probably we'll see a little bit of that happen, when when forced to work from home, when forced to work remotely, people still becoming efficient. So as we hopefully return to some sort of state, I think that will be kind of a question. I know, again, this is not specifically residential, but I think those impacts would be found in residential. What other become larger, to become larger moments or opportunities for working remotely, working from home. I mean, I think probably one question I would ask is, how is that financed, right? Because like one of the questions is that, with a lot of infrastructure here you're in your house, you're on your internet, you're using, your computer or your personal computer a lot of times for all of these things. So, is there kind of a shift to funding to fund larger spaces, technology in these within houses, something along those lines? I think those would always be for me kind of questions, in terms of the impact residentially. Probably just the kind of live work relationship seems to be the one that would really have to be rethought and reconsidered.
How about the architecture education system? Post Corona, because if you look at your work, the site visit very important. The understanding and scanning, searching, sketching, whatever, discussing in the site, very important. And architecture, in my opinion, you can't learn only the faculty in architecture studio. Also, you should visit which building is important for you, and also walking on the street, cities, understanding the relationship in the buildings. Now we are is like a prison in our studio, in our office or our home. But is there any new idea if you look at the architecture education history? We have the fantastic computational tools and instruments, and also the software program. But the architecture is a real architecture in the site.
I agree. I mean, completely. I think, there's nothing to replace that. I don't think there's anything online that is going to replace that. But I think we always have to be hopeful that we're going to return to some sense of normalcy where we'll do that. And I think probably, in terms of, let's say, the kind of shifts in architectural teaching, as we kind of go, I think we have to be looking at where are there innovations within online teaching that are happening. We kind of customize. I would say in my own kind of teaching, there's been a lot of really interesting things that have developed within that. I think, for instance, some just like small things where typically the studio culture is one that you have pinups as a group, and then you would have individual desk crits, as they call them, with students, and you go around and you talk to individuals, you make a sign up sheet. And, a typical studio week for me would be Monday, we have a general pinup we all discuss. And then Wednesday and Thursday, I see individuals. With the online format, everyone's together. And I found that the students wanted to listen into all of the individual desk crits. And I felt we learned as a culture. I mean, we don't do that when we're in studio. We don't take everybody in studio to go to each desk and talk about each project. The format made it very easy for students to continue to work on their projects, but then also to listen into all of the other conversations that are had in the studio. And so I think that's been something that I think really kind of showed in the work. There was a more understanding of what everyone was doing and what everyone's trying to achieve as kind of research and the objectives of the studio. The second thing that was nice is just to have the documentation of the work for all of these, sketches, pasting images from the references of history, contemporary references on the internet. We're working. We were working with a software called Miro, which is just a board that pins up. I think there's others that are similar to that technology. But when you can kind of paste in, anything, images from the Baroque showing this, images from Corb, images from contemporary having this, showing students this, all of images from film, all of these kind of things, and they start to pile up on a board around those desk crits, and these students would keep these from week to week to week. And we, every time we would have a discussion, all of it would be there, right? Everything would be there of everything that we discussed, and not only for each student, but for the entire studio. So these massive kind of archives and collections were really helpful in terms of generating conversation. Students could then go visit all the other the other boards of all the other students and kind of understand where the conversation and what the sketches were, and having that record. So, actually having the reviews was nice. On one hand, it doesn't substitute the kind of in-person review. On the other hand, we're able to invite other people freely that wouldn't have been able to travel, wouldn't even be other people on the other side of the world coming in to view the conversation. So that's always a challenge, even at any school. So we're, in Philadelphia, and we have a limited budget in order to invite reviewers. And so typically the majority of the reviewers end up being close that can come inexpensively and, try to get a few outside viewers and, as much as you can. Without those kind of limitations, it opens up entirely different conversations. I mean, obviously our conversation today here. So I think there are a lot of aspects to look at that are positive, and understanding, just like my work with the Baroque is never to, I never to supplant the idea of going to these buildings. I never want to provide you with an experience that one would have of going to the buildings. It doesn't make any sense. You need to go and see and be in those buildings. But I do think there are ways that allows us to see and other kind of things that we can kind of come back to when things kind of normalize a little bit, that are hugely interesting, kind of show maybe a little bit of where we need to innovate, and kind of what some of the other issues and practices that we have that are maybe, quite frankly, a little bit outdated and can be innovated upon.
Right. Question? Batuhan, digital softwares became more important for communicating, socializing in the period of the pandemic. How does it affect the future of public spaces?
Yeah, that's fascinating. I would imagine, we've been discussing this a little bit at Penn, about how to change formats once we kind of come back in, because we've been very impressed with some aspects of it. For instance, I was on the review with Hina Jamel, who's works with Ali Rahim in contemporary architect. There was one point in the review where it was open to the public. I think there were 288 people online in this review, which would never have fit in the Meyerson Gallery, even though it's not a public space, but it is open to the public. Anybody can come in for reviews. It just wouldn't have fit in there. So, and certainly, obviously, accessibility. So, just a quick kind of feedback of what we would try to do, just learning in these kind of things, is how to kind of integrate that accessibility into these kind of public spaces. So I would imagine, public space is a kind of a very vast arena to work within. But I would say, just in general, it would be nice to see a lot of these kind of different means of digital technology allowing kind of different accessibility to be integrated. We've even talked about possibly having, guest reviewers bringing in the screen and having those guest reviewers be in the crit from other places and integrating that in as you would have a reviewer to talk about it. So I think, hopefully they become better. I think I'm always an optimist and romantic. So I think, I think this period is a forced period of reassessment, but I think it's always good to reassess the ways in which you do things. And I think hopefully we'll come back at it and have different kind of critique and kind of open up maybe things that we're entrenched in doing, and we kind of now have seen them in an unfamiliar way and can propose new and different formats.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Architect Andrew Saunders. I really admire his works. I am jealous, and also I want to kill him. And
kill me. Maybe I'm not coming to.
Yeah, and then thank you very much for joining us. It was really more informative and also exciting interview with you. Thank you very much again. Thank you. You want to add anything, something? You please add, or you want to talk about any last your works on about the last exciting things. Is there any secret for young students or young architects, or like me, the young architect?
Yeah, I think future kind of projects that I'm working on. I'm doing a guest teaching. I'm supposed to be on sabbatical next spring, and I think I'm going to couple that with a guest teaching at Sapienza University in Rome. And so I've kind of been working, all the work in the Baroque topologies is all of the interiors, right? But now we're kind of looking at getting permissions to do the exteriors, which is a totally different challenge, where we would use a combination of LiDAR and drone scanning, which you have to fly them within a meter of the building, and you have issues with birds and wind and all of these kind of things. So it's interesting new challenge to take on, but more in the idea, like I was talking about before, this idea of relief. I'm interested in looking at the exteriors now, because the interiors have their own sort of autonomy, but now looking at Baroque exteriors that really are quite opaque and operate really in this kind of realm of relief, that they aren't transparent. So that's the next thing for me. So if you're in Rome and you see us flying drones around these exteriors, that's what we'll be kind of working on next. So I'm excited to work within the kind of exterior realm of these churches.
Andrew, sorry about that, but there are many questions. If you don't mind, we'd like to.
Yeah, no problem. I have time.
Okay.
Sure.
Because you are famous. Okay.
My wife disagrees.
And Tuğba Bahar Yılmaz asking a question: can VR be effective to online architectural teaching in terms of understanding buildings and scale while we are not able to visit sites?
Well, yeah, VR is something that I'm asked about quite often, even before issues of being able to visit sites and accessibility. I'm not a favor of the term virtual reality, because I like to imagine that. Sorry. I'd like to imagine that it's not about kind of showing or replacing that sort of human experience. But I do think the idea of reality capture, which is typically with LiDAR scanning and photogrammetry, are extremely valuable. So for instance, I'm teaching about these buildings that are in Rome and Piedmont, and I'm teaching them in Philadelphia. I started my first seminar before I had scanned this. So I had students looking at these in the typical way, looking at Vitcover and many documentations, going to the library. All of that's very important. and having them try to reconstruct and build a lot of these things. And a lot of the more like Vitoni and these kind of ones are not really accessible. And I have to say, once I brought back the kind of archive of scans that they work with, there's something incredible about that as a learning experience, and they are able to see and understand the work in a totally different way. Now, that being said, I don't think it's the replacement for going to see that. It's actually kind of interesting because I teach my seminar in the later part in the third year. So typically students that I have are graduating. So, it's not uncommon that I'll get emails back from, a lot of students, just a few months after taking the course, they'll say, okay, I went and I actually saw the church that I've been drawing and working through all year. So it maybe encourages them, the reality capture encourages them to be more interested to go see the actual thing. But that being said, if you talk about something where that's pretty three-dimensionally complex, if you talk about the kind of figuration and sculpture of Bernini and how he integrates it into the architecture with the paintings, it's been amazing to have those scans where students can just go in there, take them apart. Or if you look at the innovations of someone like Vitoni, where the pendentive is a kind of a classic architectural element. It negotiates the difference between the dome or the cupola and a plan. So unless you have a circular plan like the Pantheon, you need kind of pendentives to negotiate that. If you look at someone like Vintoni, one of the interesting things is he pierces those pendentives and allows light in and all of that. And they're really complex. So it's been amazing. Like one of the first exercises that I have students do, we first kind of eat our vegetables. I give them the architects. They go and get the books on the architects. They trace over the plans, understand the governing geometry, and then I issue them the point cloud surveys. So then they have the point clouds. They learn how to register them, and I ask them to, in order to kind of proof of concept, the next class they have to bring a 3D printed part of that building. And so to have a student that's looking at Vitoni and then the next week they can come in with a 3D printed Pierce pendentive and understand how they're operating with the inside and outside, that wasn't happening, without the kind of what maybe you would call virtual reality. But I think it's more about, for me, and I think the value is not about replacing the reality, but starting to show things that can't be seen in reality, right? And being able to access them in different ways, to understand these as objects that they can take apart and understand and kind of understand the working of it. So I think there's a lot of benefits besides trying to replace the actual going to in the experience, because that's not replaceable, and that's not my objective at all. I mean, if anything, my objective is to try to get students more interested in this so that they actually want to go see them in reality, but they know how they work in a kind of behind the scenes sort of way. I mean, the interiors of these Baroque churches and these architects are really, really complex mechanisms of illusions, and be able to have those in your hands and take them apart and understand them with all their complexity, with light, color, material, figuration, everything is really, really important. And I think it's really augmented the way that they understand and see the space. But that being said, it certainly is not a kind of replacement for the experience of going there.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Eileen Deirman, how do you think we can end the Baroque effect and feeling that we admire into the modern projects with modern tools and construction systems?
That's my favorite question so far. That's a really great question. I think there's so much richness in the Baroque that can happen, and I could point to, and I've tried to point out some, let's say, contemporary projects that I feel have, let's say, Baroque qualities or Baroque tendencies, and that's what I'm always trying to teach my students, because the majority of my students are designers. They're contemporary designers. University of Pennsylvania is a very contemporary school, and very forward thinking in terms of technology, design, contemporary, and all of that. So that's the audience that I teach, that I interact with, and there's already so many Baroque tendencies that are happening within, ideas of how do we take certain things that are happening within art, whether they're contemporary art, sculpture, art, painting, contemporary art. How do you start to understand what's happening in those kind of fields and arenas, and understand how does that work in architecture, right? And I think there are a lot of schools, probably SciArc is one of them, that there's a majority of faculty there are really invested in the contemporary art scene, and their whole project is sort of transposing a lot of things that are happening there into architectural effects. And so my my one of my whole kind of goals is showing the contemporary architects that these things have always been a topic. That relationship between sculpture, architecture, painting, it's one that's deeply founded in the kind of core of what it is to be architecture. So how does one then kind of go forward to, let's say, transpose or put those into contemporary architecture? I think, I think there's a lot of ways. I think the least effective way is trying to copy or mimic, specifics from that as a style. But I think there's so many, of the 6 architects that we look at in the survey, they all have their own kind of tropes or their own way of trying to architecturalize a lot of illusion, dynamics, figuration, all of these kind of things. And I think you can learn from those. So if you're looking at Cortona and the way that he uses layers, you can certainly imagine layers being used in contemporary. So a lot of these principles can be transposed to many different things. Obviously, there's a number of technologies that are allowing different types of fabrication, and things are becoming more accessible as well. So things that maybe within the kind of modernist paradigm may have seen to be gratuitous, expensive, extra, don't cost extra, aren't there. So I think a lot of those kind of boundaries can be taken down. I guess one of the issues, I think, to me, I mean, I'm not anti-modernist, but I think the modernist language, now, after 150 years, deserves the same kind of criticism one would have of Baroque or Renaissance or any of these kind of things. So what ethics are embodied? Are those ethics still valuable? I think that sometimes modernism gets a free pass as if it's somehow neutral, right? Which is really loaded, just as loaded as any of them.
Yeah, and also island question reminds us in modern building, is there any interesting architect like a Nervi and Mismechi?
Yeah, sir. I mean, you're talking about classic modern, certainly. Funny, Nervi writes the intro for some of the Baroque books, which is, Nervi's a very interesting person. I think there's probably a lot of different things. I mean, it's one of the more Baroque tendencies, I would say. You could look at something like Complexity and Contradiction, which is a book written by Venturi, right? He has in there, I think it's chapter 9, he talks about the inside and the outside. Now, Venturi, he calls the Baroque mannerism, which, there's always kind of historic debates about what mannerism is and what Baroque, but he kind of classifies it all under mannerism. But in that chapter 9 or 10, I think all of it, many of the Baroque churches that we look at are in there, and then entire book they're in there. And he kind of talks about the fundamental idea of transparency that kind of comes from what he calls orthodox modernism, the idea that the interior bleeds out to the exterior, which he kind of calls into question that. And then he talks about a lot of these buildings having discrete ideas of the interior having autonomy versus exterior. I think you're seeing a lot of that come back into architecture. I think that most of the contemporary work that I'm seeing these days, in terms of, at least in schools, is really challenging the kind of language of modernism. Doesn't mean just aesthetically, but you're starting to see a lot of these kind of principles come back in. Like, I would say that, there are Baroque tendencies and the kind of thickness of Khan. Sometimes I was just talking about Tel Aviv Museum, Scott Cohen. Scott Cohen also, his whole Contested Symmetries book starts out with Baroque analysis as well. It's interesting. There's a kind of lineage of formal analysis, right? And I was lucky to be kind of indoctrinated in that, of teaching at Cooper Union. It wasn't something that came, personally was in my undergrad, but I taught there and kind of understand it. And I think each of the kind of designers who come to that use a different lens by which they do formal analysis. So for Peter, which is exceptional, and he still teaches that at Yale, so he teaches analysis, and he'll teach a lot of these Baroque buildings as well in there. I'll see them show up in there. And for him, he's really the master, incredible. But a lot of it is two-dimensional, compositional, plan-based analysis, right? Where, for instance, Scott Cohen, I think, comes out of a similar lineage, but he was working with Robin Evans at Harvard. So Robin Evans wrote the projective cast, and you can see the idea of projective geometry is deeply entrenched in Scott Cohen's work. And so when he starts to analyze the Baroque specifically, it's not of the Eisenman kind of 2D compositional work. It's actually, he's looking in the three-dimensional from projective geometry, looking at Baroque corners and ideas of conic sections and all of these kind of things. So, I would argue in a certain sense that my own kind of take is trying to find another sort of way of looking at through the kind of lens of, of surveying and these kind of meshes of a different way of looking at these churches. So I think from all of those, there you go in terms, that's kind of Eisman, Venturi, Moretti, throw them in there, Cohen, all of this kind of, there's a lineage of this. And I think you kind of author a way at looking at those, and it helps this kind of dialogue. It helps you develop your own discourse, it says as much about yourself as it does the actual work that you're analyzing.
The question is about education system in US. I'm talking about the architecture education system. Europe and Asia. What is the differences for you? Do you have any experience teaching in any school in Europe or Asia?
Yeah, I think
because the UPenn there, UPenn has many Asian students.
Yes, of course. Yeah, UPenn
I'm not asking
has a long tradition.
Yeah, I'm not asking which school is important and perfect. We know the UPenn, exactly. Vinka mentions that.
Well, no,
we are asking what is the second, what is the third one?
Yeah, here's my perception. Okay, so I don't have. I have some experience with European schools and Sapienza, and been on reviews in a few other. I don't have much in Asian school, but this is what I would say in general. I think it still stands. I know more from my colleagues and people coming and what they want out of graduate school versus undergraduate. I think that a lot of my colleagues. Well, let's say we just. I can't officially say this, but let's say we're looking to hire a person that kind of came out of a really strong European Spanish kind of school system where it's extremely technical. You get licensed as part of the process. And that person came to the United States, didn't come to Penn. It's not I mean, Penn's great. We can talk about that, but I'm just saying, coming from a European experience and then going to the U.S. experience, and a lot of this happened. When I was going to school, a lot more Europeans were coming. I was working at the Eisman office with a lot more Germans that were coming in. They were interning there and then going to Columbia, and it seemed that the idea was that at the graduate level, they wanted something that was really different, more invested in theory, more invested in contemporary experimental means, different formal discourses. I think, that as a contrast to, let's say, like a really technical foundational kind of education makes a good coupling. And you see that happen a lot. So you don't want it to be repeated what you have received in undergraduate. You don't want more of that in graduate school. So graduate school kind of, in a certain sense, is there to sort of challenge and upset those who, a lot of people have to go into that with both admiration, but also a little bit of suspend their disbelief of what they think architecture is. And then after they get out, kind of try to glue those two back together in a certain sense. So I don't know in terms of Asia schools, but we do have a lot of Asian students that come in. And I think, and also the US students too, I think that's also typical in those two, that the undergraduates are solid foundational work that they're coming into, and then we challenge that. Same thing with undergrads in the U.S. schools, but probably the Asian schools and the U.S. schools aren't as extreme technically as like a lot of European students that come in. So that would be maybe a general conversation. And then coming to graduate schools in the U.S. There's a number of compelling schools. I think that's one of the things that may always joke. That's one of the things, not as a serious joke, that the U.S. really still does well is education and makes movies, right? They're the two things that we kind of export to the world. So I think it's a great experience. Now, what schools to go to, and all of these things. There's always a big question. I talk to students who are applying. We have open houses where students have gotten into different schools. They're trying to determine which ones to go to school. Now, I, of course, am a big advocate of Penn. I wouldn't have come to Penn and started teaching here, 6 years ago if I didn't believe in it. And it's fantastic. I have to say, Penn, all schools kind of go through different trajectories, up and down. And that depends on the leadership of the school, right? And I have to say, with Winka Dubelnum, she just got renewed for her second term as the chair, which is kind of unprecedented. I don't think there's ever been a chair that had been nominated or been approved for a second term. She's a fantastic leader. And I think for you guys going into schools, graduate schools, you have to look at what, is that 3 years, or if it's post-professional, is it going to be a year, 2 semesters? Look at the state of those schools and what the leadership is. And I think that what Winka has been able to curate and put together is a really strong group of faculty that all really, we all talk together. We all do different things, but within a certain parameters, not difference for different sake, right? So there's a good dialogue going all in the 3-year program. There's a good dialogue of those 3 years that you're kind of getting all of these people on different reviews and conversing. And we're I think a pretty tight knit group, as well as that. But I think also there's just stability where Winka's been doing it for a while and she's built that, right? And I think you have other schools that are great schools that are kind of going through leadership change right now, right? And if you look at on the East Coast, how many of these East Coast schools have new deans? So Harvard just got new dean, Sarah Whiting, which she was at Harvard when I was there. Love her, she's great. But she's kind of coming in, kind of changing the culture there. Yale, Columbia a little bit, all of these schools, Princeton, all of them have recent kind of leadership changes and this kind of thing. So I would just say all of the schools are good. I mean, the good schools. If you're going there, you're going to get a good education. You're going to come out with a good alumni connections and these kind of things. But how do you differentiate them? I think you differentiate them by looking at who's the leadership of those. So depending on the size of school, Some of them are the deans, some of them are the chairs, or this kind of thing. But that's going to have the biggest influence on your experience when you're there. So, for instance, at Penn, Winka's the chair. She's has a heavy hand in curating the lecture series, right? So she also has heavy handing in hiring the faculty that are there, especially let's say the third year when you have international people coming in and all of that. So I think she does a really good job and of all of that kind of thing. But if you go to other schools, I think you just have to look at who's the leader there, what are they trying to curate, and that happens differently. So, for instance, when I went to Harvard and what Harvard is now is not the same thing, not better or worse, but all of these kind of things. I think Penn is, all of these schools kind of go up and down and have their up and downs. I think Penn is at a really great kind of up right now. It's also had its downs at time too. So I think different schools are different. You have different things. Obviously Columbia is probably a good one to look at. In the '90s, when I graduated, I wanted to go to Columbia. Absolutely. I had Greg Lynn on my final. He said, "Go to Columbia, just call me up. We'll come in." And I worked for Peter, and I thought I was going to work for Eisenman for a year and go to Columbia, and I ended up staying there for 3 years. And by that time, things had kind of changed. A lot of the people that I wanted to go and learn from it all moved to the West Coast at that time, and Schumi had left and all of this kind of thing. So anyway, that would just be my general advice to all of you. I think, Penn is excellent right now, and I really believe that. And you can see it through the work and the faculty and how they work in the lecture series. But, you're all probably going to apply to different schools, and then you'll have to financial situation will probably have a lot to do with that, which kind of money. But also, if you're just looking purely trying to say, how do I tell the difference within these schools, I think you should look closely at the leadership and what they're trying to curate, and they change. Sorry, that's a long kind of answer, but that's usually what I tell students that are in open house and these kind of things.
Andrew, the architecture in the history, the more men think, let's say, today there are many women students, and you think the architecture will change by that kind of the more women architects, and because there are many more than boys today, the girls, women students everywhere, not only the US, also the Europe and Asia.
Yeah, certainly. I think we
are expecting the new more as a new style architecture, and the modern period there are many women architects, but not like today. Today, totally the more than men, women architects everywhere.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think first of all, it's fantastic, and I think that it certainly is a contemporary conversation that needs to be front and center. Not only gender but equity, diversity. All of these things are great. I mean, I think it's fantastic to have students with the more diverse, the better. It's really fun to teach, and I love that architecture is cultivating. Finally, it's been a little bit slow to that, right? I mean, I think, but I think all of that is excellent. I think that's in general what you're talking about in terms of history and theory, right? The history of architecture reads as a white man's sort of profession, right? And along with other professions as well. And architecture is not the only, but I think that's why I think there's a lot of questioning to kind of believe in or teach the canon of architecture, right? Because it was by white men, written by white men, and has this sort of thing. So I think I agree completely 100% with that criticism, but on the same stance, I think you can't just erase it, right? There's a long tradition of architecture, and I think that students, no matter what their kind of gender or politics are, I think that there's I always make the analogy of, I'm not a musician, but I would imagine if I'm learning guitar, I'm going to learn a little bit how to do the notes and this kind of thing, but then I'm probably going to go to other guitarists and try to mimic them and try to understand that, just to understand how they play. I feel like there's that kind of intuition, regardless of the politics of the canon or this kind of thing, to kind of look at other architects. That it's a long tradition. We've been doing this for quite a while, and I think anyone, even you take somebody like Korb, who seemed to be extreme as a modernist and reject history. He was hugely self-taught, that traveled to all of these, and he knew all of his history. Most of them do know their history, even though they appear to be radical by rejecting it sometimes in that sense. So I think the change in political culture, climate, the kind of new avenues towards diversity and equity within the student body and also within the profession and teaching academic, I think those are all great. And I think that there is a good reason to be suspect of architecture history, canon, and theory, but I don't think that divorces, or it can't become an excuse to not know it. Do you know what I'm saying? I think that it can't be a laziness in there of saying, well, because it doesn't match the politics of today, it no longer is relevant. And I think that's an issue that's much larger than architecture, that's happening with many kind of cultural aspects. That I don't know if that's what you're exactly getting at, but I think that's, for me, a little bit sad, because I think that that there's few people. I mean, it's I was presenting the historian society, and there were a lot of people that I respect, but a lot of them much older, like Joseph Connors, who wrote the forward for my book, who's the kind of premier Baroque scholar in the U.S. and was the director of the American Academy. Amazing, but he's retiring this year. And all there's a lot of knowledge. I got my interest from Eisman. Eisman kind of opened my eyes and helped me understand how to read and see architecture differently, right? But look at him. He's like 80. I mean, he's still going. But the New York Five and that generation. We have David Leatherbauer at our school. He was contemporary with Robin Evans and all of that crew as well. But I mean, that generation's getting much older, and I don't see the younger generation wanting to kind of pick up. I say the younger generation more into kind of history, theory, scholarship. So it just isn't kind of interest for them in where to carve out their niche. But I think it's still important. So that's kind of one of the reasons why I end up teaching it, because I don't have a PhD in history. It wasn't that I don't consider myself a historian, although I think anybody that teaches architecture kind of becomes a historian at a certain extent. But no, it's an interesting question, and I think it's one of the reasons why they hired me at Penn to kind of come in and introduce some of this. But also, it wasn't. It was more from the students. I think the students are curious. I think the students in general really are curious and want to know about where their profession came from. Really, and have that deep knowledge, not to repeat it, but just to kind of understand more about what they're investing in.
The Tansel Dalgalı asks a question. You reached at the question? You see that?
Yeah. Do you think that the paradigm of modernism is sufficient enough to reflect the complicated, rich structure of human nature? Are Baroque or similar topologies more closer to that complexity and richness? Wow, that's a great question.
Actually, you answered that question before. But please, you wanna add something? We would like to appreciate that.
Yeah, I would say I would point you towards Erwin Panofsky. He has a really interesting. I could do a whole seminar on articles and chapters that have been written in books called "What is Baroque?" Right? I mean, there's so many of people. Deleuze has one. Panofsky has one, Wolflin has one. There's so many chapters out there of people trying to say what is Baroque. But in relationship to your question, Panofsky writes what is Baroque, and he comes to the conclusion at the end of it that the Baroque is the first modern architecture, right? And so the question about modern architecture, you're posing them as binary opposites, modernism versus Baroque. But Panofsky talks about the Baroque as the first modern architecture because of culture that evolved around it. That the culture, obviously, you have so many things that are happening in that sort of period. The scientific revolution, you have it's a certain paradox, with the kind of religious structures and the scientific revolution coming together. All of that emanating the society is becoming more self-aware, self-critical of itself, and so in Panofsky's argument, he lays out he's basically an anti-Wolfland argument, where
And
Wolfland,
Andrew,
yeah,
you agree with that idea?
yeah,
The
absolutely. I
Baroque.
think that you can't you can't put them as binaries, but I do think that a lot of the things that are being reflected and trying to be resolved architecturally, there are a lot of paradoxes that happen within that architecture, and I think the contemporary paradigm that you're discussing has a lot of these kind of paradoxes as well. It's not as clean cut or utopian as modernism, like kind of early classic modernism, desired to be. Right? Maybe that's quick sort of answer, but I do think it's interesting that Panofsky calls Baroque the first modern architecture, because I think everybody probably wants to say that they're very different, that modernism is very different than Baroque, but he's saying that's the point in culture where culture became contemporary, and a lot of those issues are those paradoxes are kind of still with us in a certain sense.
Yeah, very interesting. We would like to discuss that issue maybe in the next interview with you. It's a good
Yeah, sure.
good point, but it takes time to talking about the which is modern, which is modernist, what is the Baroque, and it takes time. I think to, if you're interested in next time, let's talk about that idea, surrounded that idea. Andrew, thank you very much again. We got
Well, thank
many
you.
questions, and then you answered precisely. And is it, I think the Philadelphia is safe now, right?
Yeah, we didn't
Everything
get it
is
hasn't been
quiet.
that extreme. Certainly not anything compared to New York.
Yeah. And
It's not too.
okay, the stay safe, stay home.
Okay,
Have
great.
a
You
nice
too.
day, and
Thanks for everyone who joined. Thank you. Thank you for
thank you
introducing me
much,
to a whole new
everybody,
audience.
everyone.
Sure.
Stay with us, the GAD Foundation. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Gokhan.
Bye bye.